The cup of coffee hit my chest before I even understood what she'd said. "Get out of my house," Madison hissed, her voice slicing through the cold November air. Steam rose between us, sharp with bitterness and cream, soaking into my sweater and carrying that familiar smell of roasted beans I'd brewed every morning for 40 years. My late husband's house, the one I had scrubbed, mended, and tended since my wedding day, was now hers, and I was being evicted like a stranger who'd overstayed her welcome. The word widow had barely settled on my shoulders, and already my daughter-in-law was stripping me of the only home I had left in this world. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who once smiled at your table, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your story matters more than they'll ever admit. I could hear the realtor's voice echoing faintly from inside, polite and transactional, talking about square footage and market potential, as if my life were a property listing. Madison's face glowed with that new, expensive confidence, the kind that comes from owning something you didn't earn. "This isn't personal, Evelyn," she said, tugging her cashmere shawl tighter around her. "It's just reality. Harold's gone, and I can't afford to keep you here. You need to understand, I'm thinking about the kids." She always said that, "I'm thinking about the kids," as if cruelty wrapped in duty were something noble. I stood on the porch, my suitcase handle biting into my palm. The house loomed behind her, every window reflecting some small piece of my history. I could still see the faint outline on the wall where our anniversary photo used to hang, the dent on the banister from when Harold dropped the laundry basket and cursed softly so the children wouldn't hear. "Please," I said quietly. The word left my mouth before I could stop it, fragile as the breath that carried it. "Just give me a few more days." Madison's eyes flicked toward the street, where two of the neighbors, Mrs. Peterson and her husband, pretended to trim their frost-bitten roses. She didn't want a scene. "You've had 3 weeks, Evelyn," she said. "You've been sitting in that guest room, staring out the window like a ghost." Harold would never have wanted this house to fall apart. You know how much he loved order. Order. That was the word Harold always used too. He'd loved things neat, predictable, under control. I used to think it was stability. Now I understood it had been fear, the same fear Madison had inherited, the same fear that made her see me as disorder, as something that no longer fit her polished life. My grandson Adam appeared at the top of the stairs. 13 years old, awkward, with his father's solemn eyes. "Mom?" he asked. "Grandma's crying." Madison didn't look back at him. "Go inside, Adam." He hesitated. I caught his eye just long enough to see confusion, not cruelty. He didn't understand what was happening. He still thought family meant safety. When did I become someone so easy to forget? The question floated through me, soft but steady, like water wearing down stone. I stepped off the porch. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. Another small, familiar sound I'd come to love. The kind of sound you don't notice until it's no longer yours. My old rocking chair sat among the garbage bags and boxes Madison had piled on the lawn. The chair where I'd nursed Harold Jr. through the measles, where I'd mended every torn shirt, where I'd waited on nights Harold Sr. came home late from the office. I reached for it instinctively, the varnished arm cool under my fingers. "At least let me take this," I whispered. "Everything inside this property belongs to me now," Madison snapped. Her tone was clipped, rehearsed, almost businesslike. The will was clear. The house, its contents, the land. They passed to Harold Jr., and by extension, to me. You had your time here. It's over. The wind tugged at my scarf. I could taste rain in the air, that metallic scent before a storm. Somewhere behind me, a car door slammed, and the sound echoed like punctuation to her final sentence. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't true, that this house existed because of me, because I had worked 2 jobs while Harold went to night school, because I'd cleaned strangers' houses so we could make mortgage payments, because every tile and window and brick had passed through my hands in some act of love. But I also knew Madison wouldn't hear any of that. She was too young to believe in the invisible work that keeps a family alive. "You'll find something," she said, already turning away. "There's a retirement community 20 minutes east. Affordable. They have a shuttle service and bingo on Thursdays. It'll be good for you." Good for me. As if loneliness were a vitamin supplement. I stood there for a long time after she disappeared inside. The front door closed with a soft, final click, the kind that sounds polite until you realize it's permanent. The porch light flicked on automatically, bathing the yard in gold, and the falling dusk turned the world the color of old photographs. The neighbors had gone inside by then. The street was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves across the pavement. I could see my reflection in the window, an aging woman in a soaked sweater, suitcase at her side, eyes wide, not with fear but with disbelief. I didn't cry. I'd already done enough of that at Harold's funeral. Tears didn't change outcomes. They only made the cold burns sharper on your cheeks. I looked back at the house once more. Through the curtain, I saw Adam's shadow moving past the window. For a second, I thought he might wave. He didn't. Children learn silence faster than empathy when adults model it well. As I turned down the sidewalk, the weight of the suitcase felt heavier, though I hadn't packed much. 3 dresses, a winter coat, my mother's Bible, and a small velvet pouch that clinked softly with every step. Inside the pouch was a key. Not to this house, but to another door I hadn't opened in decades. The motel was only 5 miles away, but it might as well have been another lifetime. The taxi driver didn't ask questions, though I caught him glancing at me in the rearview mirror more than once. Maybe he recognized the look of someone being unmade. When we pulled up to the Sunset Inn, the sign flickered between red and blue neon. The scent of stale tobacco hit me as soon as I stepped out. I paid the driver, his eyes soft with that mixture of pity and curiosity strangers offer when they see you fallen from somewhere high. In the room, I set the suitcase on the bed and unzipped it slowly. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar from the closet back home. My fingers brushed the velvet pouch again. The small, cool circle of metal inside steadied me. I'd hidden that safety deposit box key for more than 40 years, tucked behind a photograph of my parents. I had almost forgotten it myself. Almost. Madison thought she'd thrown me away like an old quilt no one wanted. But what she didn't know was that every thread of my past had been stitched with quiet intention. Every act of obedience, every silence, every coin saved. My life might look small from the outside, but beneath the fabric, something vast had been growing for decades. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under my weight, and let my hand rest over the key. It was cool and heavy, like the truth I'd kept hidden too long. Outside, rain began to fall against the window, steady, certain. The kind of rain that cleanses what people think is ruined. I took a deep breath and whispered to the empty room, "You were wrong, Madison." "You'll see." And for the first time since Harold's death, I didn't feel invisible. I felt ready. The next morning, the light in the motel room was thin and gray, like it had lost its courage. I lay still for a long time, listening to the slow drip from the bathroom tap. It reminded me of the metronome Harold once used to keep rhythm while practicing his old saxophone, steady, mechanical, and indifferent to whether anyone was listening. I suppose time keeps its own tempo, even when we stop dancing to it. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp carpet. I could hear footsteps on the walkway outside, the shuffle of other residents waking into their own small defeats. Through the paper-thin wall, a television murmured some morning talk show laughter that felt like a foreign language. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what morning used to feel like when the kitchen filled with the scent of toast, and Harold humming off-key to the radio. But memory is a cruel painter. It always adds too much light to what was already fading. I rose, pulled the curtains open, and watched a line of pigeons pacing the telephone wire like they were taking attendance. Across the street, a gas station sign blinked between fuel prices and 2-for-1 donuts. That was my view now, numbers and neon instead of the magnolia tree Harold and I had planted the summer our son was born. I had poured water over that fragile sapling every morning before work, whispering prayers into its leaves like it could hear me. I wonder if Madison will cut it down. She's the kind of woman who trims things that don't fit her plans. I brewed the weak motel coffee, the kind that smells like cardboard pretending to be comfort. The first sip tasted like punishment, but I drank it anyway. There's a strange dignity in small rituals, even when everything around you feels borrowed. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the velvet pouch brushed against my knee. I opened it, and the key glinted in the dusty light, silver, cool, unbent. I traced its notches with my fingertip, the way you might trace an old scar to remind yourself you survived the wound. That key had once been my secret companion, hidden behind the lining of my jewelry box for decades. I'd almost forgotten it existed until Madison's words unlocked something far older than her cruelty. "What have you contributed lately?" she'd sneered. I hadn't known how to answer then, but the truth was more complicated. The truth had teeth and patience. When Harold and I first married, I was 19, soft-spoken and eager to please. He was steady, proud, the kind of man who needed the world to see him as dependable. He loved me in the way men of his generation were taught to love, through provision, not partnership. When he got his first promotion, he'd said, "You don't need to work anymore, Evelyn. A man should provide for his wife." I remember nodding, smiling even, though part of me had folded inward that day like a paper bird. I'd been raised to believe that obedience was the price of belonging, but I also learned early that security without independence is just another kind of prison. That's when I started working quietly. Bookkeeping first, then rentals, then small investments made under my maiden name. Every receipt, every deed, every dividend carefully filed in the safety deposit box that Key now guarded. Over time, the numbers grew, slow and silent like tree roots spreading underground. Harold never asked about the small deposits I made into our vacation fund. He was grateful I managed the household so efficiently. I let him think it was thrift. Maybe that was a kindness, or maybe it was cowardice. I still don't know. Now, sitting in that cracked vinyl chair, I realized the years of secrecy had finally come full circle. Madison thought she'd stripped me bare, but she'd only peeled away the illusion of dependence. She would learn soon enough what kind of woman she'd thrown away. I spent that afternoon walking downtown, the key tucked safely inside my coat pocket. The city had changed since I'd last really looked at it. New towers had sprouted beside the old brick facades I used to admire when I ran errands on Harold's lunch breaks. The cold wind whipped my hair loose from its bun, and I felt the sting on my cheeks, sharp and clean. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I felt awake. At the bank, the marble floors gleamed, and my footsteps echoed as if I were entering a cathedral built for the worship of numbers. The teller was young, barely older than my grandson, and greeted me with that automatic smile people wear before they've learned the difference between kindness and politeness. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you today?" "I need access to my safety deposit box," I said, setting the key on the counter. The metal clicked against the glass, a tiny sound, but to me, it was thunder. He typed something into his computer, his expression turning curious. "It's been quite a while since this was last accessed." "I know," I said. "It's been waiting for me." He led me through a narrow corridor lined with metal doors. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. When he unlocked the compartment and slid the box onto the table, my heart was beating so fast I thought he might hear it. "Would you like some privacy, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes, please." When the door closed, I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The scent of old paper rose up, dry and familiar, like the inside of my father's desk when I was a girl. Inside lay the story of a life no one knew I'd built. Deeds, certificates, thick envelopes of records I'd guarded like relics. I flipped through them slowly, each document a heartbeat from another decade. The ink had faded in places, but the truth was still legible. Evelyn Carter, property owner, investor, account holder. In the bottom corner, wrapped in plastic, was the ledger I'd kept since 1963. My handwriting was neat and careful, proof of every hour spent balancing ledgers for others while secretly balancing my own life. As I traced the lines of those numbers, something inside me unclenched. I hadn't realized how heavy the silence had become until it lifted. I smiled, not out of triumph but relief. The world had spent decades calling me dependable, housewife, caregiver. Those words had fit me like borrowed shoes, serviceable but never truly mine. Here, in this vault, was the version of me I'd hidden. The woman who understood compound interest before she could afford her own car. The woman who'd learned to sign contracts while pretending to volunteer at church bake sales. The key rested beside the box, glinting in the light. For 40 years, it had been my secret weapon, my silent rebellion. Now it would become my salvation. When I left the bank, the sun had started to break through the clouds. The marble steps gleamed wet from the earlier rain, and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete and roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. I bought one paper bagful and ate them as I walked, the warmth seeping into my fingers. Each bite tasted of smoke and salt and something older. Vindication, maybe. I passed a boutique window where a mannequin wore a shawl just like Madison's. I almost laughed. Money can dress arrogance in silk, but it can't teach grace. As I turned the corner toward the bus stop, I felt the weight of the key again, pressing gently against my heart. The metal was warm now, alive with purpose. Madison believed she'd taken everything from me, but she'd only given me reason to rise. Tomorrow, I would meet with my broker. Tomorrow, the woman she cast out would start buying back her life. One signature, one property, one quiet act of justice at a time. But for tonight, I just walked, breathing in the cold air and the faint sweetness of chestnuts. The streetlights flickered on one by one, steady as resolve, and I thought, maybe survival isn't loud at all. Maybe it just sounds like footsteps no one bothers to notice. The next day began with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. Not peace exactly, but the silence that comes when everything unnecessary has finally fallen away. I dressed carefully, pressing my only good skirt with the motel iron, and pinned my mother's brooch to my lapel. It was a small gesture, one she used to call, a way of reminding the world you still exist. As I looked in the mirror, I noticed the soft webbing of wrinkles around my mouth, lines Harold used to trace absent-mindedly when we read in bed. He'd always said they looked like laughter, though I couldn't remember the last time either of us had laughed without hesitation. Outside, the pavement was slick from last night's rain. The air smelled of wet asphalt and faint gasoline, an urban perfume I'd grown used to. I took the bus downtown, the same route I'd once used to visit Harold at the insurance company during his lunch breaks. The driver was young, humming softly under his breath, a melody I couldn't name but somehow recognized. Funny how sound can unlock memory faster than thought. As the city blocks rolled by, I thought about the first time Harold brought Madison home. She'd been 23, all sleek hair and sharp perfume, eyes scanning the room like a realtor assessing market value. "You have such a quaint house," she'd said, running her hand along my kitchen counter. "So vintage." She'd meant old. Harold Jr. had looked proud, as if he'd just introduced me to royalty. I'd smiled, because that's what mothers are trained to do when their sons choose poorly. The bank tower appeared like a silver spine against the gray sky. Inside, the lobby gleamed. Marble floors, polished chrome, and a receptionist who looked barely old enough to rent a car. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," she said. "Ms. Williams is expecting you." Patricia Williams had been my broker for 15 years, though we'd never met in person. Every month, I'd mailed her handwritten notes disguised as friendly letters, never revealing the full story of who I was. She'd known me as E. Carter, the discreet client who preferred phone calls over office visits. Now, as she rose to greet me in her corner office, I felt a strange sense of exposure, like stepping out from behind a curtain. "Mrs. Carter," she said warmly, extending her hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you." I have to say, I wasn't expecting our mysterious investor to be quite so... She paused delicately, searching for a word that wouldn't sound condescending. "Old?" I supplied with a smile. "You can say it. I'm used to it." She laughed, and I liked her for it. "Experienced," she said. I was going to say experienced. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and printer ink. On the wall behind her desk hung a framed quote. "Discipline is remembering what you want." I studied it for a moment before sitting down. "That's a good one," I said. "Most people remember what they wanted only after they've lost it." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "You'd be surprised how many of my clients say that. But you, well, your portfolio tells a different story. You've been very deliberate, Mrs. Carter. Strategic." I had to be. She handed me a folder, her nails immaculate and coral pink. Inside were summaries, balance sheets, projections, numbers that once seemed abstract, now suddenly tangible. My hands trembled slightly as I read. "I'd like to liquidate some of the holdings," I said after a moment. $2 million to start." Patricia's eyebrows rose, but she didn't question me. Any particular use in mind? Yes. I closed the folder. I'm buying back something that should never have been lost. Her expression softened. A home? Exactly! The transaction took time. Signatures, verification, small talk about markets and inflation. Through it all, Patricia treated me not as a client, but as an equal. It had been a long time since I'd been looked at that way. I realized then how much of my life had been spent behind someone else's name, first my father's, then my husband's, and finally, in Madison's eyes, behind my own son's. The invisibility had crept up quietly, disguised as propriety. When the paperwork was complete, Patricia stood and shook my hand again. If I may say so, Mrs. Carter, it's refreshing to see someone take charge of their story at any age. I suppose it's never too late to turn the page, I said. But as I left her office, I couldn't help wondering, had I been turning pages or just circling the same paragraph all these years? Outside, the afternoon light had changed, brighter, almost forgiving. I walked down the street and passed a small cafe I used to visit decades ago. The window was fogged from the espresso machine, and inside, a waitress laughed as she carried a tray of plates. For a moment, I saw myself at her age, tired but hopeful, believing hard work guaranteed safety. I wanted to step inside, to taste that illusion again, but instead, I kept walking. At the bus stop, I sat beside an elderly man feeding pigeons from a paper bag. His coat was worn, his hands trembling slightly as he tossed crumbs. "They never stop coming," he said without looking at me. "What's that?" "The birds. You feed one, 10 more appear. Word travels fast in the sky." He smiled faintly, eyes following the flutter above. "People aren't so different, you know. They all come around when there's something to take." I nodded. He was right. And yet, there are things you can't take from someone who's already lost everything once. When I returned to the motel, the clerk behind the counter slid a message across to me. "Phone call for you earlier," he said. "A woman. Didn't leave her name. I didn't need one." Madison. Upstairs, I sat on the bed and listened to the radiator hiss, the sound reminding me of distant applause. I could almost see her face when she'd heard about the cash offer on the house she thought she'd inherited unchallenged. I wondered if she'd thrown another cup of coffee, maybe at the wall this time. The thought almost made me smile. Still, there was a tremor beneath the satisfaction. Revenge, even when deserved, leaves a residue. I stared at my hands, still steady, still capable, and thought about what would come next. Owning something again wasn't the same as belonging to it. On the nightstand sat my notebook, the one I'd started keeping after Harold's death. I opened it to a blank page and wrote 3 lines. Tomorrow, I make the offer. Tomorrow, she learns who I really am. And maybe, tomorrow, I learn it too. The pen ink bled slightly into the paper fibers, dark and permanent. I closed the notebook gently, feeling the weight of it, the quiet finality of a promise made to oneself. Outside, rain began again, tapping the window in soft, rhythmic beats. I turned off the lamp and let the room fill with grayness. In the dark, I could hear the echo of Madison's voice from that day, her cold certainty, her polished cruelty. But now, layered beneath it, I heard something else. The steady, unmistakable rhythm of my own heart, reminding me that silence isn't surrender, it's preparation. And as I drifted toward sleep, I found myself asking the question that would follow me into the days ahead. When did survival stop being enough? The next morning arrived like an old friend knocking on a door I'd once locked. Pale sunlight slanted through the thin motel curtains, turning the dust motes into something almost holy. I sat on the edge of the bed, my feet pressed to the cold linoleum, listening to the city wake. Distant traffic, a barking dog, the faint metallic scrape of a shopping cart on pavement. Life was happening, indifferent to me, and somehow that made me feel steadier. I dressed in the same navy coat I'd worn to Harold's funeral. The fabric was worn at the elbows, but it still carried the faint scent of lavender from the sachet drawer I used to keep in our bedroom. Funny, how the smallest traces of a home can follow you long after the walls have been taken away. I brushed my hair back, fastened a single pearl earring, one of the few pieces of jewelry Madison hadn't confiscated under the pretense of keeping it safe for the family, and looked in the mirror, My reflection didn't frighten me anymore. It looked like someone beginning, not ending. By the time I reached the real estate office, my hands had stopped trembling. I'd spent half the night rehearsing what I would say, but when I stood in front of the polished reception desk, the words came naturally, as if they'd been waiting in my mouth for years. "Good morning," I said to the young woman behind the counter. "I'm here about the property on 412 Maple Street." She blinked at me, polite but distracted, clicking through her computer. "One moment. Ah yes, that's listed under Susan Blake Realty, Agent Janet Hall. Are you interested in viewing or making an offer?" "Making an offer," I said, my voice steady. "Wonderful! Do you have a realtor representing you?" "I prefer to handle my affairs personally." Something in my tone must have caught her attention. She sat up straighter, typing faster. "Of course, ma'am." "Janet should be free in just a few minutes. Would you like some coffee while you wait?" "No, thank you." Coffee had lost its comfort the day Madison weaponized it. The waiting area was small, lined with glossy brochures showing bright families in perfect kitchens. I studied their smiles, their immaculate, effortless happiness, and wondered if any of them had ever felt the humiliation of watching their own memories loaded into a moving truck. I ran my thumb along the smooth surface of my purse, feeling the faint outline of the key tucked inside. That piece of metal had outlasted everything: love, duty, invisibility. It hummed like a secret in my palm. A few minutes later, a woman in her 40s approached, her heels clicking against the tile. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked, smiling. "I'm Janet. Please, come into my office." Her space smelled of citrus cleaner and printer paper, bright and professional. Sunlight glinted off her nameplate as she gestured toward a chair. "I understand you're interested in 412 Maple Street. That's a lovely property. The seller is very motivated." "I'm aware," I said. "I'd like to make a cash offer." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's always good to hear. What amount did you have in mind?" I took a quiet breath. 550,000. 55,000 over asking. I'd like to close within 2 weeks. For a moment, Janet simply stared at me, her pen frozen above her notepad. "I see," she said finally, recovering her composure. "Well, that's quite generous, Mrs. Carter. The seller will be thrilled." I imagine she will be. Janet laughed lightly, perhaps sensing something beneath my calm. "You seem to know her?" I met her gaze evenly. "You could say that. The seller is my daughter-in-law." The color drained from her face before she quickly replaced it with professional neutrality. "Ah, I understand now. Well, I assure you, personal history doesn't affect the process here. We treat every transaction with complete discretion." "I expect nothing less," I said. "You'll find my funds are in order. Patricia Williams at Meridian Financial can verify everything." Her expression softened into respect. "I'll prepare the offer paperwork immediately." While she typed, I let my eyes wander to the framed photograph on her shelf, her family smiling in front of a lakeside cabin. 2 children and a dog. The image was simple, ordinary, and yet it struck me like a memory I'd misplaced. Harold and I used to talk about buying a cabin once he retired, somewhere quiet, maybe near water. But life had a way of demanding practical choices over peaceful ones. He'd always said, "One day, Evie." That one day had never come. "Here we are," Janet said, sliding the papers across the desk. "You'll need to initial here, here, and sign at the bottom." I took the pen. It felt heavier than it should have. As the ink spread across the page, I realized this wasn't just a purchase. It was reclamation. Not revenge exactly, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like justice wearing a quiet smile. Janet looked up after the final signature. "I'll submit the offer to Mrs. Blake immediately. She'll want to respond quickly, I'm sure." "Tell her to take her time," I said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." I left the office with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in months. The sun had climbed higher, warming the sidewalk. I walked slowly, savoring the rhythmic click of my shoes. Across the street, a florist shop had its door propped open, the scent of fresh lilies spilling onto the air. I paused, breathing it in. Harold had always brought me lilies on our anniversary, white ones that filled the house with their clean, heady fragrance. That last year, he'd forgotten. I'd bought them myself and told him they came from the neighbor's garden. It felt easier than reminding him of what memory had already taken. I bought a single stem from the shop and carried it back to the motel, cradling it like an apology. In my room, I filled the chipped glass on the nightstand with water and set the flower inside. Its reflection trembled slightly in the light, like it too was unsure what to make of survival. That evening, I sat by the window with my notebook. The page waited, open and expectant. I wrote, "Today I bought my past back from the woman who thought she owned it." The words looked simple, but they pulsed with something deeper. Something that felt like closure wearing new shoes. I ran my fingers over the ink until it smudged faintly, as if to remind myself that permanence is a lie we all chase. Outside, the motel sign buzzed, throwing red light across the room. A couple argued in the parking lot below, their voices rising and falling like the tide. I closed the notebook, the sound of it soft but certain. Somewhere in the night, my phone began to ring, breaking the silence. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Madison's number had a way of vibrating differently, like a snake's warning rattle. I let it ring until it stopped. For a moment, I sat in the quiet that followed, feeling the rhythm of my own pulse steady again. The offer was made, the storm was coming, and as the lily's white petals unfurled in the dim red light, I found myself whispering the question I hadn't dared to ask in years. What happens when the truth you buried finally blooms? The call came again before sunrise. Same number, same rhythm. 3 sharp rings, then a pause, then 2 more. Madison had never been patient, even when pretending to be gracious. I watched the phone glow on the nightstand, its vibration rattling the water glass beside the lily. For a moment, I thought of answering, if only to hear what tone she'd chosen. Rage, disbelief, or that syrupy false concern she'd perfected. But I let it stop. Silence was power she still didn't understand. I poured the stale motel coffee and stood at the window. The air outside looked bruised, gray folding into violet. A man in a janitor's uniform crossed the parking lot, whistling something tuneless. It struck me then how ordinary the world remains, no matter who's losing their footing inside it. My reflection in the glass looked steadier than I felt. I touched the brooch on my lapel, my mother's pearl flower, the one she'd worn to her own divorce hearing in 1958. Always keep something that's yours, she'd told me, even if it's just a pin. At 7, the motel phone rang again, the front desk this time. "Mrs. Carter? There's a woman here asking for you. Says it's urgent. Tell her I'm not available. She says she's family." "I'm not." The clerk hesitated. "Should I tell her to leave?"
"Yes," I said, then softened.
"No, tell her I'll meet her at noon, in the diner across the street." When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of choosing. I'd avoided her voice for weeks, yet part of me wanted to see her eyes when she realized what she'd miscalculated. Vindication can be a dangerous appetite, but after so much erasure, I needed to taste it once. The diner smelled of bacon grease and old coffee, the kind of place that made time seem circular. I arrived early, slid into a booth by the window, and ordered hot tea. The mug was chipped at the rim. I turned it so the flaw faced away from me. The waitress, a woman about my age, smiled politely before returning to her counter. Across from me, the vinyl seat gleamed empty under the harsh fluorescent light. I traced the rim of the cup with one finger, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet clink of forks. Madison entered exactly on time. Of course she did. She was always punctual when confrontation served her. Her coat was expensive, but her face looked raw around the edges, her confidence smudged. She scanned the room until she spotted me, then approached with that tight smile people wear in front of witnesses.
"Evelyn,"
she said, sliding into the seat. "You've caused quite a stir."
"Have I?"
I lifted the cup, savoring the heat against my palms. "I thought I'd simply made a purchase." Her eyes narrowed. "You went through my realtor. You knew that was under contract. It was a public listing. You're trying to humiliate me." "I don't need to try, Madison." The words surprised even me with their calm. Her mouth opened, then closed again, as if she'd lost the script she'd rehearsed. I watched her regroup. "You can't possibly afford that house," she said finally, lowering her voice. "Unless you did something illegal." "You can't just appear with $500,000, Evelyn. People will ask questions. Let them, I said. The answers are tidy. She leaned forward, perfume heavy and sweet, the same cloying scent she used to fill my kitchen with when she baked for church fundraisers. "Where is this money coming from?" she demanded. "My own hands," I said simply. "The same ones that scrubbed your floors when you complained about dust. The same ones that wrote the checks for Harold's tuition before you were born. You'd be amazed what a pair of old hands can build when no one's looking." She blinked, and for a flicker of a second, confusion overtook anger. "You're lying!" Harold handled all the finances. "Harold handled what I allowed him to see," I replied. Her laugh was sharp, brittle as ice cracking. "You expect me to believe you hid millions from my husband and his father? For decades? I don't expect you to believe it," I said. Belief isn't required for truth. The waitress appeared then, setting down a refill I hadn't requested. Madison forced a smile until she walked away, then hissed, "You're out of your mind. If you think you can steal that house out from under me—" "It was never yours," I interrupted. "You inherited the title, not the story. And stories have a way of reclaiming themselves." For a moment, the only sound between us was the diner clock ticking toward noon. Madison's face hardened. "You're going to regret this," she said. "You've embarrassed my children, my husband's memory." "Your husband's memory?" The words left my throat sharper than I intended. "You mean my son's? The man I raised, fed, defended? The man who vanished into your ambitions and forgot his own mother's number?" Her mouth tightened. "He's been under a lot of pressure." "So was I said quietly. "For 40 years. I just carried it differently." The light outside shifted, catching her gold earrings, making them flash like coins. I remembered her sneering once that my jewelry looked sentimental. Now, sentiment felt like the only real currency between us, and she had none. Madison pushed back from the booth, the legs scraping the floor. "If you think I'll let this happen, you're mistaken." "You've already let it happen," I said. She stood there, trembling, not from fear, but disbelief. I watched her turn and leave without paying for her coffee. I left money on the table for both of us. Even victories, I've learned, should end with civility. Back outside, the winter air bit at my cheeks, but I felt strangely clean. The sky had cleared into a pale blue that hurt to look at. I crossed to the bus stop, the lily stem wrapped in tissue inside my purse, its faint scent following me. By the time I reached my room again, the motel clerk handed me a thick envelope. "Delivery for you, Mrs. Carter," he said, curious. "Looks official." Inside, I found a letterhead from Henderson & Associates, attorneys at law. The words swam for a moment before settling. Notice of meeting. Estate and property inquiry regarding 412 Maple Street. Attendance requested of Mrs. Evelyn Carter and Mrs. Madison Blake. I set the letter down on the bedspread, the ink still smelling faintly of toner and threat. So it had begun, the formal challenge, the final unmasking. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Beneath the fatigue, a quiet current of resolve moved through me. I thought of my mother's voice again. Always keep something that's yours. I had, and soon the world, Madison most of all, would know just how much that something was worth. As evening fell, I sat beside the window and watched the traffic lights flicker red to green to red again, the endless repetition of order and permission. Somewhere beyond that glow, the house on Maple Street stood waiting, its windows dark, its rooms hollow but intact. I imagined walking through it again, touching the banister, breathing in the faint scent of cedar from the floors I'd polished for years. I imagined reclaiming it, not just as a structure, but as proof that invisible women can build empires while no one watches. The lily on my nightstand had begun to curl at its edges, the white fading to ivory. I turned off the light and whispered to it, "Not yet." Tomorrow. Because tomorrow, I would sit across from Madison again, but this time, not as her victim. Tomorrow, she would learn that I hadn't just survived her cruelty. I'd profited from it. The morning of the meeting, I woke before the alarm. The motel room was still dark, the air heavy with the smell of stale air and disinfectant, but something inside me had already cleared. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do, and exactly who I was doing it for. I dressed slowly, carefully, as if every button and seam could armor me against what was coming. The navy dress again, pressed flat with the motel iron, my mother's brooch pinned firmly to the left side. I'd polished my shoes the night before until the leather reflected the thin lamplight. Rituals, I've learned, matter more when your dignity has been taken. You rebuild it with small gestures, one steady motion at a time. Outside, dawn was only beginning to bleed into the horizon. A truck rumbled down the highway, its red lights fading into the fog. I sipped weak motel coffee, burned my tongue, and smiled. Pain has a way of reminding you you're still here. By 9, I was standing in front of Henderson and Associates, the law office where Harold's estate had been processed. It looked smaller now, more ordinary, just another brick building with an overconfident nameplate. Inside, the receptionist recognized me immediately, her professional smile wavering. "Mrs. Carter, they're waiting for you." I nodded and followed her down the hall. The conference room door was half open. From the hallway, I could hear voices, Madison's sharp, impatient tone, Margaret's smooth condescension, and the faint murmur of my son, Harold Jr. I hadn't heard his voice since the funeral. The sound of it, muted and uncertain, made my heart ache in a way I wasn't prepared for. When I stepped inside, the conversation stopped. Madison was standing near the window, her posture stiff, her lipstick too bright for daylight. Margaret sat at her side, her gloved hands folded neatly on the table. My son looked smaller than I remembered, his tie askew, his eyes darting between us like a boy caught between feuding parents. "Mother," he said softly. "Harold." I nodded, then turned to the lawyer at the head of the table. "Mr. Henderson," he stood politely. "Mrs. Carter. Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." I took the chair opposite Madison. She didn't greet me. She didn't need to. Her expression said everything her mouth didn't. "How dare you?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "We're here today to address concerns raised regarding the pending sale of the property at 412 Maple Street. Mrs. Blake has requested verification of your financial capacity to purchase the home in question." "Verification?" I repeated. "Surely a cashier's check and a signed contract are sufficient." "Ordinarily, yes," Henderson said. "But given the, familial nature of this situation, Mrs. Blake has expressed certain doubts. She believes it's in everyone's best interest to ensure transparency." "Transparency?" I said quietly. "A lovely word, often used by people who can't stand to see what's in the mirror." Madison's mouth tightened. "I have every right to ask where this money is coming from," she said. "You never had income of your own. My husband and his father supported you your entire life. Unless you won the lottery, there's no possible way you could afford a $500,000 cash offer." I looked at her for a long moment. "Do you remember the last thing you said to me before you threw me out?" Her eyes flicked nervously to the lawyer. "I don't see how that's relevant." "You said, 'What have you contributed lately?'" I continued, my voice steady. "Do you recall that?" She didn't answer. "Well," I said, opening the folder I'd brought with me. "Let me contribute something now." I laid the papers neatly across the table. Bank statements, property deeds, investment records. They spread like wings across the polished wood. The air changed. I could feel it. The lawyer leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Margaret's composure faltered. My son's eyes widened. "These documents," I said, "represent the work of a lifetime. 40 years of savings, investments, and income from rental properties. Assets purchased and managed under my name. My maiden name, before I married Harold." "That's impossible," Madison said. Her voice cracked on the word. I slid another document forward. "Here's the ledger from 1963, showing the first property I purchased. I told Harold I was taking sewing lessons. Instead, I was doing bookkeeping for a dress shop. Every penny went into this account." Harold Jr. reached for the page, scanning it as if it might vanish if he didn't read fast enough. "Mom," he whispered, This says you've owned property since before I was born." "I have," I said. 8 properties now, all paid off, and several investment accounts besides. My total liquid assets exceed $8 million. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. Madison's hands gripped the edge of the table. "You expect us to believe you hid millions of dollars from your husband? From your own family?" "I didn't hide it," I said calmly. "I preserved it." Harold believed his job defined his worth. I believed our safety required something more reliable than pride. Margaret's voice trembled. "Evelyn, Surely you can see how deceptive this seems.
I met her gaze.
You call it deception. I call it foresight. The lawyer cleared his throat again. Mrs. Carter's financial documents appear legitimate. I can verify their authenticity directly with her broker at Meridian Financial.
Madison's face flushed scarlet.
You mean this charade is real?
I turned toward her.
It's only a charade when you're pretending, Madison. I've never pretended to be helpless. You just preferred me that way. Harold Jr. looked between us, his voice breaking. Why didn't you tell us, Mom? All these years, you could have made things easier for everyone. I told your father once that I wanted to work, I said. He looked at me like I'd betrayed him. So I learned to do it quietly. Sometimes love requires silence. But silence has its limits. Madison stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This changes nothing, she said. Legally, the house still belongs to me.
For now, I said softly.
The lawyer intervened quickly, sensing the temperature rising. Mrs. Blake, the sale agreement is valid. Mrs. Carter has the funds and the legal right to purchase the property.
Madison turned toward him, her voice sharp.
You're telling me I have to sell my home to this woman?
Correction, I said.
You're selling my home back to its rightful owner. She stared at me, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. I stood, gathering my papers. Mr. Henderson, please proceed with the closing at your earliest convenience. As I moved toward the door, I paused beside my son. Harold, I said quietly, you don't have to choose sides. Just remember who built the ground you're standing on. He didn't answer, but I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Shame, maybe, or realization. It was enough. Outside, the winter air hit my face like baptism. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the sunlight find me. The cold smelled faintly of cedar and exhaust, sharp and alive. I reached into my purse, touched the key, and felt its weight, solid, certain, mine. As I walked away, I thought of all the times I'd chosen silence to keep the peace. Maybe peace built on silence isn't peace at all. Maybe it's just the sound of a woman waiting for her moment to speak. And today, I finally had. By the time I reached the corner, my legs were trembling, though not from weakness. It was something closer to release. A long-held breath finally let go after 40 years of pretending it didn't matter. The street smelled of winter rain and hot asphalt. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from the astonishing fact that I was still capable of defiance. I stopped at a cafe I hadn't entered since Harold was alive. It looked smaller now. The chalkboard menu had changed, but the bell over the door still made the same soft jingle, like an old friend clearing its throat. The waitress smiled politely when I asked for tea. I chose a corner table and sat with my hands wrapped around the cup, its warmth steadying me. Across the room, two young women were arguing over a laptop. Their voices overlapped, quick and bright, full of the kind of certainty youth carries before the world teaches you how fragile it is. I listened without meaning to, catching fragments about equity and pitch decks. For a moment, I saw myself at their age, typing invoices at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, dreaming of small freedoms disguised as numbers. I used to imagine that someday I'd own something of my own, a place, a business, anything that couldn't be taken away. I suppose, in my own quiet way, I did. The spoon clinked softly against the porcelain as I stirred the tea. The sound reminded me of Harold at breakfast, tapping his cup when he wanted more sugar. He'd never been cruel, only careless, in that way men sometimes are when the world tells them their comfort is a virtue. I used to think obedience kept love safe. Now I know it only teaches people how to stop seeing you. Outside, a bus sighed to a halt. People stepped off in coats and scarves, their breath turning to ghosts in the cold air. I wondered if any of them would guess that the older woman in the window, the one holding her tea like an anchor, had just changed the course of her own life. Probably not. Invisibility is my best disguise. When I left the cafe, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my son. Mom, we need to talk. Please don't make things worse. His words stung, though I'd expected them. Children rarely understand the difference between conflict and clarity. I put the phone away and started walking toward the bus stop. The city looked sharper now, edges defined by the thin winter sun. At the motel, the clerk glanced up as I entered. Everything go all right at your meeting? he asked. I smiled faintly. Better than all right, he chuckled, probably assuming I'd won some minor argument about rent. Good for you, ma'am.
Good for me.
The phrase lingered as I climbed the stairs to my room. I hadn't heard those words sincerely in years. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and froze. On the bed lay an envelope. My name, Evelyn Carter, written in thick black ink, the kind used by people who want to appear official. No return address. My stomach tightened as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper.
Mrs. Carter.
Effective immediately. Your application to purchase 412 Maple Street has been challenged pending verification of estate division under spousal inheritance clause. Please refrain from contacting the seller directly until review is complete. It was unsigned, but I didn't need a signature. Only one person in that office had both the arrogance and desperation to try something so petty. Madison. She wasn't giving up. I sank into the chair beside the window and let the paper flutter onto the table. Outside, the motel sign buzzed its red light into the dusk. It would be easy, I thought, to let fatigue masquerade as surrender. To tell myself that reclaiming a house wasn't worth another battle. But it wasn't about walls or furniture anymore. It was about the story written into them, and who got to tell it. I reached for my notebook and began to write, the pen scratching softly over paper. Let her fight. I've spent a lifetime fighting quietly. Now I can afford to do it loudly. I stopped, listening to the rhythm of the words. They sounded like footsteps. Mine. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The radiator clanged and hissed, and each burst of heat smelled faintly of rust. I got up, pulled on my coat, and stepped outside. The parking lot was slick with frost, the air cold enough to sting my throat. I tilted my face upward and watched my breath dissolve into the dark. The sky was clear, moon hanging like a pearl above the city. I thought of my mother again, standing on our farmhouse porch the day I left for Chicago. Don't marry a man for shelter, she'd said. Build your own roof, even if it's made of tin. I hadn't understood her then. I do now. From somewhere down the street came the faint sound of laughter, a group of college students, tipsy and alive. I smiled, remembering a night decades ago when Harold and I had danced barefoot in our unfinished kitchen. We had no money, just a bottle of cheap wine and the conviction that love could weather anything. It almost did. But conviction doesn't pay bills or preserve dignity. A gust of wind tugged at my scarf, bringing with it the scent of something faintly floral, perhaps someone's laundry soap or the last trace of a garden caught in the season's shift. It filled me with an odd calm, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking for permission to exist. Back inside, I placed the envelope under the lily's vase on the nightstand. The flower had begun to brown at the tips, its fragrance fading. I touched one curling petal gently until it broke away in my fingers. It felt like parchment, fragile but not yet gone. I thought of Madison then, her expensive perfume, her clipped tone, her need to control every inch of air around her. She'd built her world out of performance, and I had just torn down her stage. She would come after me, of course. But I had patience, and records, and above all, truth. I sat on the edge of the bed, the city's hum filtering through the window. The glow from the motel sign cast everything in a red pulse, like a heartbeat. I looked at the fading lily and whispered, "You'll bloom again when I do." Tomorrow, I'd meet with Patricia again to prepare my response. Tomorrow, Madison would receive proof so undeniable it would turn her fear into silence. But tonight, as I leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, I let myself drift between exhaustion and quiet triumph. The radiator sighed once more, like applause at the end of a play. When had survival turned into strategy? When had silence become language? Maybe the answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this. The woman they thought they buried under obedience had found her way back to the surface, and she wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, the air outside was thin and silver, the kind that holds its breath before snow. I walked to the bus stop with my gloves tucked into my pockets, clutching the small folder Patricia had couriered overnight, the one that held my lifeline. Inside were copies of my verified assets, notarized by the bank, along with a brief letter addressed to the court overseeing Harold's estate. Evidence, simple and neat, just like I'd always kept it. The bus rumbled down the street, and I climbed aboard, nodding to the driver, a young man with kind eyes who greeted everyone with the same cheerful, "Morning!" I admired that sort of optimism, the kind that doesn't need proof to exist. I sat by the window, the city sliding by in muted color, shopkeepers lifting metal shutters, children in bright jackets waiting for school buses. Life, continuing without permission.
My stop came sooner than I expected.
The courthouse loomed ahead, square and severe, the color of old paper. The last time I'd been here was decades ago, signing marriage papers, believing permanence could be written in ink. Today, I was signing something different, a reclamation of identity.
Inside, the marble floors echoed beneath my heels.
I'd forgotten how small footsteps sound in buildings meant for judgment. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up. "Estate division review?" she asked automatically.
"Yes," I said. "For Harold Carter.
"Room 214, ma'am. Second floor."
I thanked her and took the stairs slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to feel every step.
By the time I reached the door, Madison was already inside. She wore a black suit that looked more like armor than clothing. My son sat beside her, avoiding my eyes, and their lawyer, a sharp-looking man with a briefcase full of bluster, was whispering something in her ear.
When I entered, all conversation stopped.
Madison's expression hardened instantly. "Well," she said, "the prodigal matriarch arrives."
I closed the door gently behind me.
I wasn't aware mothers could be prodigal.
The judge,
A woman about my age with steady gray eyes and the kind of face that had seen too many families implode over inheritance, gestured for silence. "Let's begin." Madison's lawyer started first, his tone oily with practiced civility. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Madison Blake, seeks to challenge the purchase of her late father-in-law's property on grounds of financial impropriety. We question the source of funds used by Mrs. Carter and ask for temporary suspension of the transaction until full review." The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Carter, would you like to respond?"
"Yes, Your Honor." I stood slowly, my knees aching but steady.
"For 40 years, I worked quietly. Bookkeeping, real estate, investments. Every dollar I own is documented. My husband believed he was our provider, but I learned early that security is never a gift. It's an insurance policy you write yourself."
Madison scoffed. "That's a poetic way of saying deception." The judge's gaze cut to her.
"Mrs. Blake, you'll have your turn."
I opened my folder and handed the notarized documents to the clerk, who carried them to the bench.
"These are verified statements from Meridian Financial and legal ownership records dating back to 1963. I've paid taxes under my maiden name every year. My assets are self-earned and separate from the estate."
The judge flipped through the pages.
The silence stretched long enough for Madison to start fidgeting. "These appear legitimate," the judge said finally. "Mrs. Blake, your claim?"
Madison leaned forward, her voice brittle.
"She's manipulating the system. My husband's father built that house for our family. She's exploiting a loophole to humiliate us, to humiliate me."
"Your father-in-law built that house with his wife,"
I said evenly, "and his wife helped pay for it while raising his children. You've mistaken inheritance for entitlement."
The judge cleared her throat again.
"The court recognizes Mrs. Carter's independent assets. The transaction is valid. There's no legal barrier to her purchase of the property."
Madison's lawyer began to object,
but the judge raised her hand. "That will be all. The review is closed."
It was over.
Madison stood abruptly, color rising to her cheeks. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "You can't just waltz back into that house after everything."
"Madison," my son interrupted quietly,
but she didn't stop.
"you were given a home, Evelyn."
"Given a life. You should have been grateful." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw the cracks under the polish, the fear behind her fury. "I was grateful," I said softly. "I'm just not obedient anymore."
Her mouth opened, but no sound came.
The silence between us was almost tender. The judge banged her gavel lightly. "This matter is settled. Court adjourned." Outside the courtroom, my son caught up to me. His tie was loose again, and his face looked 10 years older than yesterday. "Mom," he said, almost whispering, "why didn't you tell me?" "About the money? About any of it?"
I studied him.
The fine lines by his eyes, the way his hands kept moving as if searching for something to hold. Because I wanted you to grow up believing strength didn't have to be proven with wealth, I said. I didn't want to raise another man who measured worth in ownership.
He lowered his head.
I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know. I touched his arm gently. Just don't let her teach my grandson that same lesson. He nodded once, eyes bright, and walked away. When I stepped outside, the air hit me like a benediction. Snow had started to fall. Light, slow flakes drifting through the gray morning. The courthouse steps shimmered with the first thin dusting of white. I stood there for a long while, watching people hurry past, their umbrellas blooming like dark flowers.
A car horn blared in the distance, breaking the spell.
I smiled faintly. The world was still noisy, still impatient, still alive, and so was I. At the bus stop, I pulled out my notebook again, my hands steady despite the cold. It's done, I wrote. The house is mine again. But what do you do with a victory that feels like memory instead of triumph?
The ink bled slightly in the damp air.
When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard and sat near the back. As the city moved past the fogged windows, I saw my reflection. Not triumphant, not broken, but whole. The kind of whole you can only earn after being underestimated long enough. Back at the motel, I placed the folder on the nightstand beside the lily. Only the stem remained now, brittle and dry. I didn't throw it away. I simply leaned it against the vase, a reminder that beauty doesn't need to last to mean something. Tomorrow, I would return to the house on Maple Street. Not as a guest, not as a burden, but as its keeper. I didn't know what I'd find inside after all the changes Madison had made. Maybe the smell of her perfume, maybe just dust and silence. But it would be mine. As the snow thickened outside, the city lights blurred into a soft glow. I closed my eyes and whispered to no one. When you've been invisible long enough, even your own reflection feels like company. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't make me lonely. It made me free. The house stood waiting for me beneath a sky the color of pewter. Snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the streets hushed, every sound padded and distant. The taxi pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the pale light. "You sure this is the address, ma'am?" the driver asked, glancing back at me in the mirror.
"Yes," I said. "I'm sure."
The old maple tree in the yard leaned slightly toward the house, heavy with frost. I could still see the faint gouge in its bark from when Harold Jr. had crashed his bicycle into it as a boy. That tree had outlasted everything: storms, laughter, and the slow decay of our family. I stepped out, the crunch of snow beneath my boots echoing in the stillness. The front gate squeaked the way it always had, a small, defiant sound. My key, newly cut, gleaming, slid into the lock without hesitation. The door opened to a breath of cold air tinged with lemon polish and something else, something faintly foreign. Madison's scent lingered like perfume spilled too generously, a sterile sweetness that didn't belong. For a long moment, I didn't move. I stood on the threshold, letting my eyes adjust to the half-light. The living room stretched before me, unfamiliar yet painfully known. New paint, a cooler shade of gray than I'd ever chosen. Sleek furniture, the kind that looks expensive but doesn't invite you to sit. The lace curtains I'd sewn one spring afternoon were gone, replaced by something sheer and impersonal. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of the latch settling was the first thing that felt right. The floor beneath my feet was polished to a sterile shine, but I could still trace in memory where the old rug used to lie, where Harold would shuffle his feet while reading the morning paper. The ghost of that life clung to the corners like dust too fine to sweep away. I walked slowly through the house. Every object seemed to glare at me like an intruder. Even the light had changed. It used to fall golden through the windows. Now it bounced cold off the chrome fixtures Madison had installed. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the faint unevenness beneath the paint. I'd plastered that section myself after a storm cracked the siding. My fingers still remembered. In the kitchen, the change was worse. Marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, a chandelier above the island that looked like a tangle of glass icicles. I reached for the cabinet above the sink. Empty. Another. Also empty. But when I opened the drawer nearest the stove, I found one small remnant, a chipped white mug with faded blue flowers. Mine. the one I'd used every morning for 30 years.
My throat tightened. I held it to my chest and let the memories rise. The smell of coffee, Harold's soft humming as he buttered his toast, the sound of the children running down the hall. It wasn't nostalgia that hurt. It was the reminder that life had once been so loud, and now even my breathing felt too loud in the silence. I set the mug gently on the counter. "Still here," I whispered. The words hung in the air like steam. Upstairs, I opened the door to what had once been our bedroom. Madison had turned it into something else, perhaps a home office. The floral wallpaper was gone, replaced by a bland white. The closet stood empty except for a single hanger swinging lazily, as though startled by my presence. On the windowsill lay a small silver button. I picked it up. Harold's, from his favorite cardigan. The sight of it undid me more than the empty house ever could. I sank onto the edge of the bare desk, turning the button over in my fingers until the edges pressed into my skin. "You left everything too soon," I murmured, "and I stayed too long." The sound of tires crunching on the driveway pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced through the window. A silver car. Her car. My breath caught. Madison stepped out, wrapped in her long wool coat, her hair sleek despite the falling snow. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the house. Then she walked toward the porch. I didn't move. I wanted to see how she would knock, whether it would be polite or possessive. It was the latter. 3 sharp knocks. I opened the door halfway. "Madison?" "Evelyn," she said, her voice tight. "I suppose you're enjoying yourself." "I'm just getting reacquainted," I replied evenly. She looked past me into the house, her eyes flicking over the furniture as though searching for her reflection. "You've made your point," she said. "You won." "Congratulations. This isn't a competition." "Oh, it's always a competition," she snapped. "You just like to pretend you're above it." The snowflakes caught in her lashes as she glared at me. For the first time, I noticed the faint tremor in her hands. "Do you know what this looks like?" she demanded. "To everyone? You, sweeping in with your secret fortune, buying back the house just to humiliate me?" I opened the door wider, letting the cold air rush between us. "I didn't buy it to humiliate you. I bought it because it's mine, because no one should be thrown out of their own home and called a burden for surviving." Her lips tightened. "You're delusional." "Perhaps," I said. "But I'm a delusional woman with the deed in her name." She flinched, just slightly, as though the words hit something raw. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled the maple branches overhead, scattering frost between us like dust from old pages. "I hope you're proud," she said finally, her voice brittle. "I'm not proud," I said softly. "I'm free." She stared at me, confusion flickering beneath her anger, as if she couldn't comprehend the difference. "You'll regret this," she said. "Maybe," I replied, "but I've already lived with worse regrets than this." Her gaze darted past me again, landing on the chipped mug on the counter. For a moment, her expression softened, just barely. Then she straightened her coat and turned toward the driveway. I watched her walk away, her heels sinking into the slush. When she reached her car, she hesitated, her hand on the door handle. She didn't look back, but her breath hung in the cold air like a question she couldn't bring herself to ask. Then she got in and drove off. When the sound of the engine faded, I closed the door and leaned against it. The house seemed to exhale with me, a quiet sigh that filled the empty rooms. I looked down at Harold's button still resting in my palm and smiled faintly. "It's just you and me again," I whispered. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet as I walked back to the kitchen. I filled the chipped mug with water and placed it on the counter beside the button. The morning light slipped through the window, casting long, gentle lines across the floor. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. It was mine. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. That first night back in the house, I couldn't bring myself to sleep upstairs. The bed that had once held decades of conversation and quiet forgiveness now belonged to another time. I spread a blanket on the living room sofa instead. The air smelled faintly of cedar from the firewood stacked near the hearth, though I hadn't lit a flame yet. I lay there, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house, the way old wood speaks after years of being misunderstood. Every sound was both familiar and new,
like hearing a song you'd forgotten you once loved. Around midnight, the furnace kicked on, the same low rumble it had made when Harold used to get up in the dark to check it. My hand drifted over the button I'd left on the coffee table, small, cold, perfectly round. Somehow, it felt like he was here, watching, but not haunting. Outside, snow brushed against the window pane. I thought of Madison then, probably sitting in her rented apartment, her pride bruised but not broken. She wasn't evil, just shallow. She'd mistaken control for safety, the same mistake I'd made once too. I wondered if she realized that this loss might one day be her salvation. I woke at dawn to the smell of my own breath in the cold air. The power had dipped overnight, leaving the house quiet. Pale light filtered through the sheer curtains, the kind Madison had hung to impress buyers. They looked delicate, but they held the morning well. I pushed them aside and watched the maple branches sway gently. Beneath them, a small bird hopped through the snow, leaving tiny prints like punctuation marks. After coffee, instant, the way I'd learned to make at the motel, I started unpacking. It took less than an hour. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases. That realization didn't sadden me. There's a strange comfort in having nothing left to lose. Around 10, a knock echoed at the door. I hesitated, too firm to be a neighbor, too polite to be Madison. When I opened it, my son stood there, looking older than I remembered. His tie was crooked, his hair uncombed, and his eyes held that nervous shine men get when they're about to apologize, but don't know how. "Mom," he said, "can I come in?" I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, scanning the room as though it were a museum of mistakes. His gaze stopped at the mug on the counter. "You kept that old thing?" "It kept me," I said simply. He tried to smile, but couldn't. "I don't know where to start." "Then start small," I said, gesturing toward the sofa. "Sit." He sat, his shoulders slumped, his hands restless on his knees. "Madison's not herself lately. She's been angry, embarrassed. I guess I am too." I leaned against the doorway. "Because I have money?" He looked down. "Because I didn't know." "Because I let her treat you like—" "Don't," I interrupted gently. "We all choose the truths we can live with. You chose peace. I chose silence." He nodded, swallowing hard. Was it worth it? Keeping it all secret? The question lingered like fog. At first, yes. I wanted to protect your father's pride. Then it became habit. And then, it became armor. I thought if I hid what I'd built, no one could take it away. I never imagined I'd need to use it to buy back my dignity. He rubbed his temples. "I feel like I failed both of you." "You didn't fail," I said. "You simply didn't look closely." "Most people don't." He glanced up at me then, really looking, for perhaps the first time since childhood. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't," I said softly. "You live better. You raise your children to see people, not what they're worth." He nodded slowly. "Lisa misses you. Tommy, too. Does Madison?" He hesitated. "She doesn't know how to yet." That made me smile. "Then we're alike." He exhaled a shaky laugh, and for a moment the tension eased. He looked around again. "You're really keeping the house?" "I am." "Alone?" "For now." I watched a speck of dust drift through the light. "I think I need to learn who I am in silence again." He stood, slipping his hands into his pockets. "If you need anything." "I will ask," I said, though we both knew I probably wouldn't. Before he left, he paused in the doorway. "Dad would have been proud of you." "Maybe," I said, but he wouldn't have understood why. When the door closed, I stood there for a long time. The house felt different again. Lighter, as if it had exhaled something it had been holding. By afternoon, I found myself in the garden behind the house. Most of it lay buried beneath snow, but I could still trace the shapes of my old flower beds. I knelt and brushed away the top layer, revealing the brittle remains of last summer's roses. The scent of cold earth rose around me, metallic and clean. I'd always believed a garden remembers its keeper. I thought about planting again come spring, something stubborn, something bright, maybe tulips, maybe wild mint, maybe both. As I straightened, my knees popped in protest. Aging is a symphony of small noises, and I'd learned to listen without shame. The cold air bit at my fingers, but it felt like proof that I was still alive. That evening, I lit the fireplace for the first time since Harold's funeral. The flames caught slowly, licking the dry wood until it crackled. The warmth filled the room inch by inch. I poured myself a small glass of wine, the last from a bottle I'd saved for years, and sat near the fire. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about revenge or vindication. I was thinking about what came next. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, its rhythm blending with the pop of the fire. I closed my eyes and listened. Beneath the sounds of the house, I could almost hear my mother's voice, the one that had carried me through every quiet rebellion. Don't let anyone tell you what you deserve, Evelyn. Build your life so no one gets to decide for you. I smiled into the firelight. I did, Mama, I whispered. It just took me longer than I thought. Outside, the wind shifted, scattering snow against the windows. The house creaked, not from age, but from settling, accepting me again. When I finally went upstairs, I paused in the hallway, fingers brushing the wall where the paint bulged slightly over an old nail. I could almost feel the heartbeat of the place beneath my skin. In the mirror of the darkened room, I caught my reflection, a silver-haired woman standing steady, her face lined not by defeat, but by endurance. When did I become someone who survived everything? I murmured. The question wasn't sad. It was wonder. I turned off the light, letting the house breathe around me. The fire downstairs flickered softly, casting orange patterns against the walls. And as I slipped beneath the blanket, alone but not lonely, I realized the truest inheritance I'd ever received wasn't the house, nor the money, nor even the freedom. It was the quiet certainty that I had always been enough, even when no one else believed it. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the lace curtains I'd found boxed in the attic, the same ones Madison had replaced and I'd quietly restored. The air smelled faintly of smoke from last night's fire, mingled with the sweetness of old cedar. I sat at the kitchen table with my chipped mug of coffee, both hands wrapped around it as if to hold the morning steady. The silence was deep, but not empty. It had a pulse, the kind of stillness that belongs only to homes reclaimed after war. Outside, the maple's branches glittered with frost. The sky was clear, the light almost tender. It should have felt like victory, I suppose, but instead, it felt like standing in a church after everyone has gone home. Beautiful, yes, but lonely in its echo. I took a sip of the coffee, grimacing slightly at its bitterness. I hadn't made it right. Harold always used to joke that my coffee could dissolve the lining of a truck tire. It wasn't true, but it made me laugh every time. Funny how grief doesn't vanish, it only changes texture. It becomes something you stir into your mornings, the way sugar refuses to dissolve entirely in cold water. A sudden knock startled me. I set the mug down, my pulse rising. Through the window, I saw a small figure standing on the porch, bundled in a red coat. Lisa! When I opened the door, the cold rushed in, quick and bright. "Grandma!" she said, smiling, though her voice carried the careful tone of a child, unsure whether joy was allowed. "Lisa!" I said softly. "What a surprise!" She held up a small paper bag. "Mom made cookies yesterday. She said they didn't turn out right, but I thought maybe you'd still like some." My throat tightened. "I'd love some." She stepped inside, her boots squeaking on the floor. "Wow," she whispered, looking around. "It's so different now." "Yes," I said. "It is." She hesitated, glancing back toward the door as though worried her mother might appear. "Mom doesn't know I came," she said quickly, "but she's been sad. Like, really sad. And Dad said sometimes people need time to fix what's broken." I smiled faintly. "Your father's right." She pulled the cookies from the bag and placed them carefully on the counter, slightly burnt at the edges, uneven, exactly the way a child's apology would look if it could be baked. I poured her a glass of milk, the old habit automatic. "How's school?" "Okay," she said, sitting at the table. "We're doing a project about family trees." "I wanted to put you on mine, but Mom said maybe wait a bit." I swallowed hard. "Did she say why?" "She said some branches need time to grow back." The answer was so gentle, so unexpectedly wise, it made my chest ache. "That's a good way to put it," I said. We ate cookies in silence for a few minutes. They were dry, but they tasted like something truer than sweetness. "Grandma," she said suddenly,
her voice small. "Why did you buy the house back?" I looked at her and saw Madison's eyes, but softer. Curious, not cunning. Because some things are worth fighting for, even if no one else understands why. She frowned slightly, processing that. Mom said it wasn't fair. Maybe not, I said. But fairness isn't always the same as rightness. Her gaze drifted toward the living room, where the fire had burned low to ash. Can I see my old room? Of course. Upstairs, the door creaked open to reveal a space stripped bare. No posters, no toys, just the faint shadow where a bed once stood. Lisa stepped inside, her breath visible in the cold air. It's smaller than I remember, she said softly. Things usually are when we return to them, I said. Our memories add their own walls. She turned to me. Are you mad at Mom? I hesitated. I was, but anger gets heavy after a while, and I've carried enough weight in this life. She nodded solemnly, then reached for my hand. Her glove brushed against my skin, small and tentative. I miss when we used to bake together, she whispered. So do I. Downstairs, the front door opened again, followed by hurried footsteps. Lisa? Madison's voice cut through the quiet, tense, worried. Up here, Lisa called. Madison appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed from the cold. For a moment, mother and daughter looked at each other, and something unspoken passed between them. A thread pulled tight, but not broken. I told you not to wander off, Madison said, her voice too sharp to hide her fear. I just wanted to bring Grandma cookies, Lisa said quickly. Madison's eyes flicked to me. The defensiveness faded almost immediately, replaced by exhaustion. I'm sorry, she said. She missed you. I should have known she'd come. She's always welcome, I said simply. The silence between us felt different this time. Not icy, just fragile, like glass newly cooled. I didn't come here to fight, Madison said, her voice low. I wanted to see the house one last time. You don't need permission, I said. She hesitated, then stepped inside the room. Her gaze moved over the walls, the bare floor, the small indentations where furniture once stood. I thought making it new would make it better, she said quietly. But I never felt at home here. Not really. Maybe you were trying to erase too much, I said. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I don't expect you to forgive me, Evelyn. I just want you to know I understand now. About you. About what you built. I didn't build it to prove anything, I said. I built it so I'd never be powerless again. For the first time since Harold's death, Madison looked like the woman my son had once fallen in love with. Not the ambitious mask she'd worn, but the tired, yearning person beneath it. I'm sorry, she whispered. For all of it. Lisa glanced between us, eyes wide, sensing something sacred. Apologies don't change the past, I said gently. But they can soften its echo. Madison gave a small nod, blinking back tears. Do you think there's any chance we could start over? I thought for a long moment before answering. There's always a chance, I said finally. But this time, it won't be on pity or control. It'll be on honesty. Do you understand? She nodded again, and the relief in her face was quiet but real. Downstairs, the clock chimed once, a sound I hadn't heard in years. Come, I said softly. Let's have tea. In the kitchen, I poured hot water into 3 mismatched cups. The steam curled upward, catching the morning light. Madison took hers with both hands, as if afraid it might spill. For a while, we said nothing. Lisa hummed under her breath, drawing shapes in the condensation on the window. The house was still, but not empty anymore. I watched Madison watching her daughter, and I saw the shift happen. The slow breaking of pride. The return of something human. Thank you for letting us in, she said quietly. I smiled. You never really left. When they finally rose to go, Lisa hugged me tight. Madison lingered at the door, her hand brushing the frame. It smells the same, she said softly. Some things hold on, I replied. After they left, I stood alone in the kitchen, the sunlight warming the floorboards. The air still carried their presence, a trace of perfume, a whisper of forgiveness. And for the first time since Harold's passing, I felt something like family again. Not restored, not perfect, but beginning. That evening, after they left, the house held a different kind of silence. Not the cold vacancy of abandonment, but the pause between breaths.
I sat by the fire again, the flames gentler this time, and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the small, almost secret noises that make a home feel alive. I thought about Lisa's little hands pressing the cookie bag into mine, about Madison's unsteady voice as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Those words had landed like snow, soft but heavy when they settled. I hadn't expected them to move me, yet they had. Forgiveness, I was beginning to understand, isn't a single act. It's a slow, stubborn decision you make over and over until it starts to feel like truth. The fire cracked, sending a spark upward. I reached for my glass of water, and the faint scent of lemon oil drifted from the wood beside me. It reminded me of the days when I'd polish every corner of this house until it glowed. Not out of pride, but because it was the only way I knew to express love. When Harold would come home, he'd smell the lemon and smile, as if order itself was proof of devotion. When did I become someone who equated cleanliness with worth? The question rose quietly, unexpected. Maybe the answer was hidden in all those years of making myself small enough to fit inside his comfort. Harold was never cruel, but he was careless in that way good men can be. The way that expects gratitude for kindness while ignoring the cost of it. I stirred the fire again, watching embers shift and scatter. Age, I realized, doesn't erase old lessons. It only makes you brave enough to unlearn them. I decided to visit the basement. I hadn't stepped down there since before Harold died. The air was colder as I descended, the smell of dust and metal thick and grounding. My flashlight beam swept across old shelves lined with boxes, labeled in my own careful handwriting. Taxes, 1994. Receipts. Winter linens. Christmas ornaments. I traced the edge of a box labeled personal and smiled faintly. Inside were things too sentimental to discard. Harold's pipe, a bundle of letters from my sister, a small notebook filled with grocery lists written in my younger hand. But beneath those lay something I hadn't expected, a manila envelope sealed with yellowing tape. On it, Harold's handwriting. To Evelyn, if you ever find this, my heart gave a slow, startled thump. I sat on the step and peeled back the tape. Inside were 2 letters and a faded photo of us in front of the house the day we'd bought it. I remembered the moment clearly, his arms slung over my shoulder, both of us laughing at the crooked "for sale" sign I'd insisted we keep. I unfolded the first letter. Evelyn, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I wrote it the night after my second heart scare. You were asleep upstairs, and I watched you for a long time. I realized how much of your life you've spent taking care of everyone else. Me, our son, this house. I never said it enough, but I saw it all. Every sacrifice, every quiet thing you did to make us feel safe. I've never been good at saying thank you, but if you're reading this now, know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you, and I hope you've kept something for yourself. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. The air in the basement felt warmer suddenly, or maybe it was just the blood rushing to my heart. For all my resentment, for all the years of silence and misunderstanding, Harold had seen me after all. Maybe too late, but he had seen. The second letter was shorter. If I go first, don't let them make you small. The house is yours as much as it ever was mine. And if our son forgets that, forgive him. He learned from me how to mistake love for control. I smiled through the tears I didn't bother wiping away. You old fool, I whispered. You were better than I gave you credit for. I sat there for a long while, rereading the words, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. There was a strange relief in it. Not closure exactly, but completion. The kind of understanding that comes when time finally circles back to fill the gaps. When I went upstairs again, the fire had burned low, but the room felt softer somehow. I placed Harold's letter on the mantel, beside the chipped mug and his button. A small altar of what remained. Not worship, just remembrance. The phone rang, its sound sharp in the quiet. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me said answer. Evelyn? It was Madison. Her voice was small, uncertain. Yes? I hope it's not too late to call. It isn't. There was a pause, filled with unspoken words. Then she said, Lisa told me you still have the old garden in back. I do. Under the snow somewhere.
She wants to help replant it in the spring. I told her we'd ask if that's okay. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. It's more than okay. It could use new hands. Madison exhaled audibly, like someone releasing a held breath. Thank you. For what? For answering. For not hating me. I never hated you, Madison, I said. I just waited for you to see me. The line was quiet, but I could almost hear her nodding. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, dear. When I hung up, I stared at the fire until only the faint orange glow remained. It was strange how forgiveness could warm a room better than flame. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, my hand brushing the banister Harold had polished every winter. At the top, I paused, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere in the darkness, I thought I heard his voice again, soft as wind. Keep something for yourself. I did, I whispered. Finally. In my room, I drew the curtains open. The moon hung low over the maple tree, its branches silvered and strong. Beneath it, my footprints from earlier still marked the snow, leading to the gate. I imagined them freezing overnight, permanent proof that I'd returned not just to a house, but to myself. As I slipped beneath the quilt, I realized the ache in my chest was no longer grief. It was gratitude. Heavy, imperfect, but alive. And somewhere deep inside, the part of me that had spent a lifetime being silent finally whispered back, I'm still here. The morning light woke me gently, spreading across the room like a quiet visitor. The air was crisp, carrying that faint winter hush that feels like the world itself is pausing to listen. For the first time in years, I woke without the weight of dread pressing on my chest. I lay there for a while, tracing the pattern of cracks in the ceiling, the same ones I used to promise Harold I'd repaint, though I never did. They felt comforting now, like wrinkles on a familiar face. Downstairs, the house greeted me with its soft symphony of settling wood and ticking clock. I brewed my coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching as a pair of sparrows hopped along the frozen fence. The maple tree's branches were bare, its bark dusted white, but even in its stillness, I could sense it waiting, patient, certain that spring would return. I poured the coffee into my chipped mug and took a sip. Bitter as always. Maybe I liked it that way now. It reminded me that not everything sweet has to stay that way. When the doorbell rang, I startled slightly, sloshing coffee onto my wrist. I wiped it with a dish towel and went to open the door. A man stood on the porch, a stranger, though his presence felt oddly familiar. He was tall, in a wool coat, holding a worn leather portfolio under his arm. Mrs. Carter? Yes, I said cautiously. I'm Daniel Brooks. I work with your husband's old company. May I come in? The name stirred a faint memory, one of Harold's business associates from years ago. I hesitated, then nodded. Of course. He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the furniture, the faint scent of lemon polish. Looks just like Harold described it, he murmured. That caught me off guard. He described it to you? Yes, he said, setting his portfolio on the table. Before he passed, Harold asked me to keep some records sealed until after the estate was settled. Legal, financial, and personal. He wanted you to have them once everything was in your name. I frowned slightly. I thought the bank handled all of that. They handled what they knew about, he said. His tone was respectful but deliberate. But Harold left something else behind, something outside the books. My pulse quickened, part caution, part curiosity. What kind of something? He opened the portfolio carefully and slid an envelope across the table. Inside were several old deeds, notarized documents, and a folded letter with my name written in Harold's familiar, deliberate hand. Your husband invested quietly, Brooks said. He put money into small properties in your name. A cabin in Pine Valley, a plot of land in Meadow Creek, and... He paused, glancing at me. A trust fund established for your grandson, under your guardianship. I blinked, the words slow to land. For Tommy? He nodded. Harold believed in starting things over properly. He didn't want his mistakes passed down. He wanted redemption to come from you. My throat tightened. I reached for the letter, but my hands trembled. The paper felt both lighter and heavier than anything I'd ever held. Brooks stood to leave.
He told me you'd know what to do with it.
I looked up at him. Did he ever say why he kept this from me? He smiled faintly. He said you'd have stopped him if you'd known. And with that, he was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with the envelope. The house seemed to hold its breath as I unfolded the letter. Evelyn, it began. If you're reading this, then time has done what it always does. It's kept moving without asking. I made more mistakes than I can count, but the biggest one was assuming strength meant silence. You taught me that the quietest person in the room often holds the most power. I didn't always understand it, but I saw it in you. Everything you built, everything you endured, it mattered. I want Tommy to grow up knowing that strength doesn't come from inheritance, but from example. Let him learn from you. And if you ever find peace, keep it safe. You've earned it. The handwriting wavered near the end, the ink darker in some strokes, as if pressed by a shaking hand. I folded the letter back carefully, the edges softening beneath my fingers. I sat there for a long while, staring at the papers spread across the table. A cabin, a plot of land, a trust for the boy who still called me Grandma even when told not to. Harold, in his clumsy way, had tried to make amends after all. That afternoon, I called my son. He answered on the second ring. Mom? There's something I want to show you, I said. Can you and the kids come by tomorrow? Of course, he said quickly. Everything okay? Yes, I said. For the first time, I think it might be. When I hung up, I poured myself another cup of coffee. Outside, the sun had started to dip behind the maple, its light stretching long and golden through the windows. The room glowed, soft and quiet. I set Harold's letter on the mantel beside the others, the collection growing like a slow conversation between the living and the gone. Then I opened the window slightly. The cold air slipped in, crisp and sharp, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a neighbor's chimney. It brushed against my face like a benediction. Later, as dusk deepened, I walked through each room slowly, turning off the lights one by one. The soft click of each switch felt ceremonial. The house didn't resist anymore. It seemed to breathe with me, its shadows gentle, its silence kind. I paused at the window and looked out at the street. Snowflakes began to fall again, the kind that drift lazily, not in haste. Across the yard, the porch light cast a small circle of gold that shimmered against the white. I thought about how much had changed, how much had been lost, and how much had quietly returned. Madison's voice from last night echoed faintly in my memory. Do you think there's a chance we could start over? Yes, I thought now. Not as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, not as rivals or symbols of pride, but as two women who'd learned the hard way that strength isn't in winning, it's in releasing the need to. I closed the curtains and let the darkness settle around me like a shawl. For years I had lived as if waiting for permission, to speak, to rest, to claim what was mine. But tonight, for the first time, I didn't need anyone to grant it. I walked upstairs, the steps creaking softly beneath my feet. The button from Harold's cardigan still lay on my nightstand, its metal catching the faint moonlight. I held it between my fingers and whispered, "We're both learning, old man." The window was open just enough for the wind to slip through, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke, and something else I couldn't name. Maybe peace, maybe promise. And as I lay down, I realized I no longer feared what tomorrow might bring, because tomorrow, whatever it held, would belong entirely to me. The next morning began with the smell of rain instead of snow. The season had turned overnight, as if the world itself had decided it was time to start over. Drops tapped lightly against the windows, soft and rhythmic, like fingertips on glass. I rose early, before the house fully woke, and brewed a pot of coffee. This time, I made it strong but smooth, an act of small mercy for myself. The kitchen filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the kettle's whistle. I poured my coffee into the chipped mug and set 2 extra cups on the counter. My son and his family were coming. It had been years since we'd all sat at this table without tension thickening the air. The thought made my heart tremble, but not with fear, more like cautious hope. I tidied the living room, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because ritual still grounded me. I wiped the dust from the mantel, straightened the stack of letters, and touched the edge of Harold's photo. "They're coming," I said aloud, as if he could hear me. "Be kind if you're listening." By the time the car pulled up, The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I heard Lisa's laughter before I saw her, the sound bright and defiant against the gray morning. She ran up the path first, waving a pink umbrella, followed closely by my son and, a step behind him, Madison. When I opened the door, Lisa threw her arms around me. "Grandma, we brought breakfast." I looked down to see a box of pastries wrapped in white paper, slightly soggy from the rain. "Perfect," I said, and kissed the top of her damp hair. My son smiled, the kind of soft, uneasy smile that carries both apology and relief. "Morning, Mom." "Come in before you all catch cold," I said, stepping aside. Madison hesitated for only a moment before following them inside. She wore no makeup, just rain-frizzed hair and a wool coat that had seen better days. For the first time, she didn't look like someone performing composure. She just looked human. We gathered in the kitchen. Lisa unpacked the pastries with ceremony while I poured coffee. The first few minutes were awkward, small talk about weather, school, work. But slowly, conversation began to stretch its legs. Madison reached for her cup, wrapping both hands around it. "This house smells like my childhood," she said quietly. "It should," I replied. "You helped shape it." She looked up, surprised, maybe unsure whether I meant it kindly, but I did. The years she'd spent here, the arguments, the laughter, the slammed doors, they were all threads in the same fabric. You can't tear one out without unraveling the rest. After breakfast, we moved to the living room. The fire burned low, filling the room with amber light. My son sat beside the window. Lisa sprawled on the rug with her drawing pad, humming to herself. Madison lingered near the mantel, her eyes landing on Harold's letter. "You found more," she said softly. "Yes," I said. "He left some things for us. For all of us, really." I handed her the second letter, the one addressed to me, but meant, I suspected, for them too. She read in silence, her lips moving faintly. When she reached the end, she pressed the paper to her chest. "He always seems so distant," she murmured. "I didn't think he understood." "Neither did I," said. "But maybe understanding doesn't come on time. Maybe it arrives only after we've stopped expecting it." She nodded, blinking back tears. "He wanted you to forgive him." "I already have." She looked at me then, really looked, as if she were seeing not an adversary, but a woman carved from the same exhaustion she carried. "You were right," she said. "About everything." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I was just stubborn enough not to let pain have the last word." My son cleared his throat. "Mom, you mentioned you had something to show us." I nodded toward the table, where Harold's folder sat neatly stacked with the deeds. "Your father left more than we knew. A cabin in Pine Valley, land in Meadow Creek, and a trust for Tommy. It's all under my name, for now, but I don't intend to keep it." He frowned. "You don't have to." "I'm not giving it away," I said. "I'm giving it meaning." The cabin, maybe it becomes a place for all of us again. The land could be sold, the money used for something useful. But the trust? That stays. It's for your son, so he learns that inheritance isn't about money. It's about what kind of people we raise." Madison's eyes shimmered. "You really mean that?" "I do." Lisa looked up from her drawing. "Can I draw the cabin when we go?" "You can draw whatever you want, darling," I said, smiling. That's how things begin. The room filled with warmth that didn't come from the fire alone. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. A piece stitched from ordinary conversation, from the small mercy of being seen. After they left that afternoon, I stood by the window, watching their car disappear down the wet road. The house felt quiet again, but not lonely. The kind of quiet that comes after a song ends and you still feel it echoing inside you. I made another cup of coffee and carried it to the garden door. The snow had melted, leaving patches of dark soil showing through. I stepped outside, the cold, damp air brushing my face. The ground was soft beneath my boots. I knelt, scooping a handful of earth, damp and rich. "Still breathing," I murmured. The soil smelled of life waiting to happen. I closed my eyes, imagining tulips pushing through it come spring. Red, yellow, and white, a riot of color against all this gray. When I stood again, I felt something loosen inside me, something I hadn't realized was still clenched. Maybe it was fear, maybe pride, maybe both. Back inside, I lit the fire once more,
Not for warmth, but for the sound, the comforting crackle that had become my evening companion. On the mantel, the three objects, Harold's button, the chipped mug, and the folded letter, caught the firelight. They looked almost holy in their simplicity. I sat in my armchair, the same one that had been mine since before Madison's renovations, and closed my eyes. I could still hear Lisa's laughter, Madison's hesitant voice, my son's quiet gratitude. It wasn't perfection, it was repair, and repair, I'd learned, was holier than wholeness. The rain picked up again outside, steady and patient. I listened, counting each drop as if it were marking time. When had my life become so full of second chances? Perhaps it always was. I'd just been too busy surviving to notice. I looked around the room, at the worn edges of furniture, at the fire painting slow light across the walls, and whispered the only prayer I still believed in. Let it stay like this, just a little longer. The house didn't answer, but the walls seemed to sigh in contentment, and for once, that was enough. The rain slowed overnight, tapering into a soft drizzle that left the world washed and reflective. Morning arrived with a strange tenderness, the kind that only comes after everything that could break already has. I woke before dawn and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the faint tick of the clock downstairs. The air smelled faintly of ash and coffee, the scent of quiet survival. I made my way to the kitchen, slippers whispering over the floorboards. The house was cool, but not unfriendly. I started the kettle and stood by the window as the sky shifted from charcoal to silver. My reflection looked back at me, the faint lines deeper now, but softer somehow. Peace had a way of settling into the skin, like sunlight absorbed after years of winter. The maple tree outside glistened with raindrops. For decades, I had looked at that tree and seen the measure of time, the way it lost and grew back its leaves year after year without complaint. This morning, I saw something else, endurance that didn't need applause. Maybe that was what I'd been trying to learn all along. When the kettle whistled, I poured hot water into my mug, the same chipped one that had followed me through loss and renewal. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around the warmth, and let my thoughts drift. What would I do now? The question had hovered for days, patient and unanswerable. For most of my life, purpose had been dictated by marriage, by motherhood, by necessity. But at 66, for the first time, the silence after the question wasn't frightening. It was invitation. I thought of the cabin in Pine Valley, of the letters Harold had left, of Madison's tremulous smile when she said, "Thank you." I thought of Lisa, her little hands brushing dirt from my garden bed, her laughter echoing down the hall. Maybe the point was never to reclaim what had been taken, but to keep something alive long enough for love to find its way back. A soft knock at the door startled me. I glanced at the clock, too early for visitors. When I opened the door, the mailman stood there, his blue cap glistening with rain. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, handing me a padded envelope. "Morning," I replied. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and left, leaving faint footprints on the porch. Inside, I examined the envelope. No return address. The handwriting, though, was familiar, my son's. I tore it open carefully. Inside was a single page and a small photograph. The letter read, "Mom, I found this while going through Dad's old boxes. I think it belongs to you. We're heading to Pine Valley next weekend. Lisa keeps asking when you'll come see the cabin. She says it doesn't feel like ours until you do. We'll wait for you. Love, Michael." I turned the photograph over. It was one I'd never seen. Harold and me, younger, standing in front of the unfinished cabin. He had his arm around me, his face smudged with dirt and joy. Behind us, the forest stretched wide and green, sunlight catching in the half-built windows. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That day came rushing back, the smell of sawdust, the rough feel of his hand in mine, the promise of beginnings we hadn't known how to finish. We'd argued that morning over paint colors, but he'd kissed my forehead and said, "We'll get it right. Eventually." Eventually had arrived. It just took a lifetime. I traced the edges of the photograph and smiled. Then I folded it gently, slipped it into my pocket, and began packing a small bag. A few clothes, the letters, and the chipped mug. Not much, but enough. Before I left, I walked through the house one last time. The living room glowed softly with morning light, dust motes drifting like quiet blessings. On the mantel, Harold's button caught a glint of gold. I touched it with my fingertips and whispered, "Thank you." At the doorway, I paused. The house no longer felt like something I needed to protect. It felt complete, like a chapter that had found its final sentence. The drive to Pine Valley was longer than I remembered, the roads winding through open fields slick with rain. The wipers beat a steady rhythm, like an old metronome keeping time with my thoughts. I passed landmarks from a life half forgotten, the rusted water tower, the diner that still smelled of coffee and fried hope, the hill where Harold once promised to build a porch big enough for our dreams. When I reached the valley, the rain had stopped. Mist clung low over the trees, curling around their trunks like smoke. The cabin stood just ahead, tucked between two pines, its wood darkened with age, but sturdy, proud. I parked, stepped out, and inhaled deeply. The air tasted of pine and wet earth, the scent of things still growing. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating a small table and a few chairs. Someone, likely Michael, had swept and repaired the hearth. A folded blanket rested on the couch, and on the counter sat a note. "Welcome home." I smiled. As I moved through the room, I felt time collapse around me, not erasing itself, but softening. Every version of me that had ever lived seemed to exist here at once. The young bride full of plans, the weary wife counting bills, the mother holding her breath during arguments that never resolved, and the older woman who had finally learned that peace doesn't need permission. I stepped outside onto the porch. The rain had left everything glistening, the steps, the branches, even the old tin mailbox at the edge of the clearing. A few drops still clung to the tips of pine needles, catching light like small stars. I sat down on the wooden step and pulled the photograph from my pocket. The paper was already curling slightly at the corners. "You were right," I whispered to the memory beside me. "We did get it right." Eventually, a breeze moved through the trees, soft and steady, and for a moment I could almost hear Harold's laugh carried on it. Low, familiar, forgiving. I stayed there until the sun broke through the mist, spilling gold across the clearing. It caught on my hands, my face, the mug I'd brought and set beside me. Steam rose from the coffee inside, curling upward like a quiet prayer. When I finally stood, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The cabin door closed behind me with a gentle click. The world around me was alive with sound. The whisper of leaves, the drip of water from the roof, the distant hum of a bird calling through the trees. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed wasn't an absence. It was arrival. I stood there, breathing it in, until the wind shifted and carried the scent of pine across my face. Clean, green, infinite. Then I whispered, softly but clearly, "I forgive you." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They simply dissolved into the air, becoming part of everything that had ever mattered. And in that small, endless moment, I knew I was free.